When Jamarcus walked to his job interview one sunny afternoon, he had no idea he would spot one of the most terrifying and disturbing sights along the way. Looking into the murky, overgrown canal, he spotted his first ever alligator with a pair of legs sticking out of its mouth. Hit like and subscribe. This is Fierce. It was a Thursday night on September 21st, 2023, and 41-year-old Sabrina was walking home. Except that she didn't have a house. The place she called home was a camp in some woods in Largo, Florida. It was a known refuge for homeless people, and it had been some time since Sabrina had a roof of her own over her head. She fought with addiction most of her life, but that didn't make her a bad person. She lived for her family, particularly her daughter, 23-year-old Brianna Doris, and her young grandchildren, aged just 1 and 3. She could never help them out financially, but she always offered to look after the children when she could, and was one of those people who would help those she saw struggling, whether it was helping an elderly person load groceries into their shopping cart or helping someone cross the road. But on that fateful night, no one was looking out for Sabrina. She had been into town and was heading back to the woods. Sabrina wrapped her arms around herself. When she was just 40 feet from the edge of the woods, near 134th Avenue North and 121st Street North, she had to cross a canal. It was known as McKay Creek. The water was murky. It was covered in green algae and duckweed. She crossed the pedestrian footbridge over the water daily, but she failed to notice a dark shape protruding from the water's surface. It was mostly submerged in the canal. Only its large, round eyes were visible. It was an alligator. But this was not just any alligator. This was huge. Measuring over 13 feet long, this giant was using the canal to move between Ridgecrest Lake and Taylor Lake. People knew there were alligators in the two lakes, and they had spotted some enormous ones in the past. It's believed that all bodies of fresh water in Florida are inhabited by alligators. With 1.3 million in the state, there's a good chance of running into one if you're foolish enough to jump into a pond or a lake. Sabrina, however, was not foolish, but something did happen that night. Maybe she tripped by the canal. Maybe she lost her footing. Nobody knows. But she ended up tumbling down the bank and into the canal. And she landed right next to the alligator. Always an opportunistic hunter, the alligator immediately snapped its jaws. Sabrina saw the enormous shadow erupting out of the water right next to her. There was nothing she could do. She didn't even let out a scream before the reptile clamped its jaws around her waist. It shook its head so violently from side to side that the air was knocked from Sabrina's lungs. The power of the bite crushed her bones. The pain was electrifying, but the adrenaline was pumping through her body, giving her every chance to fight back. But Sabrina was no match for the alligator. In a matter of seconds, the damage was done. Sabrina breathed her last breath, and the water was still. Nobody heard a thing. Nobody saw the commotion in the canal. Not until the next day. Jamarcus Bullard had a job interview on the Friday afternoon. Slightly nervous, but ready to give it his best, he set off to the location. It was a warm, sunny day. There wasn't a cloud in the sky as Jamarcus walked along the sidewalk. Then he came toward McKay Creek. As he stepped onto the metal footbridge, he glanced down into the water. The canal was as murky as ever, but there was something that caught his eye. It was large and dark and sticking out above the surface. It took Jamarcus a few seconds to realize that it was an alligator, and a really big one. He smiled and stopped walking. He leaned on the railings and instinctively reached for his mobile phone to take a photo. He had never seen a gator before, and this one was an impressive size. But as Jamarcus flicked his camera on, he saw something that made his heart leap. There was something inside the alligator's mouth. It was pale and white. It was a pair of legs. Jamarcus immediately thought that it must have been a mannequin, as it didn't look lifelike. It was just the lower half of a torso. But then came the shocking realization that the legs weren't made from plastic. They were real human legs. Jamarcus froze as he watched the alligator sink beneath the surface. The legs disappeared from sight, and barely a ripple remained. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. As quick as he could, Jamarcus rushed to a nearby fire department and ran inside to tell them what he had just seen. Within minutes, emergency services arrived on the scene. The area was cordoned off, and the search for the alligator began. But it hadn't moved. It reappeared above the surface in the same location, with its jaws still clamped firmly around the legs and lower torso of Sabrina. It was a chilling reminder of just how dangerous these animals are, and just how unsafe Florida's waterways were. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission sent officers to capture the animal. While it was lying semi-submerged in amongst the thick weed of the canal, they secured a rope around its mouth and a chain to help haul it out of the water. When it was held in position, an officer shot the alligator in its skull with a rifle. It died instantly. It was an impressive beast. Another officer took out a measuring tape and recorded an impressive 13 feet 9.5 inches from snout to tail. The human legs were retrieved from the water, and the department now had the gruesome task of identifying the victim and performing a necropsy on the gator. When it was cut open, more body parts spilled out. They were able to identify Sabrina from some tattoos on her body, and it wasn't long before the family received the devastating and shocking news. Sabrina was only the third person to have been taken by an alligator in Pinellas County since the 1970s. However, it didn't matter how rare such an attack was. Her family was still inconsolable at her loss. The community came together to support Sabrina's young daughter and grandchildren. Now that they had identified the victim, officers still wanted to find out exactly what had happened. They scoured the camp where Sabrina had been living. Although it was just yards from the water, there was no sign that the alligator had ventured into it and plucked Sabrina from her bed in the middle of the night. There was no sign of a struggle along the canal bank, no skid marks where the 41-year-old may have slipped into the water. It was a mystery. Some theorized that Sabrina may have died before being consumed by the alligator, but the autopsy report showed that was not the case. She died from blunt force trauma and sharp force injuries. These were consistent with an alligator attack. They were also able to determine that she had died on the Thursday night or early Friday morning, as her remains had not been inside the alligator for long. She was alive and well on the Wednesday, as she had spent time with her family, and her body was discovered on the Friday afternoon. As news of the terrible incident spread throughout the community, people were shocked and saddened. Locals would walk their children along the edge of the canal. They would stop and look at the water. It was a disaster waiting to happen. Now, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission erected fencing along the side of the canal and signs to warn people of the dangers. It reminded people that it's possible to live alongside these ancient reptiles, but stay away from the water's edge.